Welcome back to the deep dive. You know, when we think about American food, we tend to picture something really static,
Mm-hmm.
like a culinary Mount Rushmore,
Yeah,
the burger, the hot dog, apple pie. It just feels like this solid, unchanging thing.
it does. But if you actually dig into the historical records, the research shows that perception is, well, it's completely wrong. American cuisine hasn't just been evolving.
Yeah.
It has lost a staggering amount of its history, a whole menu of foods that didn't disappear because they tasted bad, but because they were systematically purged.
And that is the absolute core of what we're unpacking today. We're looking at a silenced culinary memory. And our deep dive shows that the disappearance of these really nourishing, complex foods, it wasn't driven by taste, it was driven by forces far more powerful.
Yes. Things like race, class, industry, and politics.
Exactly.
Our mission today is sort of to act like historical forensic chefs. We're exploring these lost dishes and tracking how the pressures of American society really decided what got a permanent spot on the menu and what got thrown out.
And we've broken it down into three main arenas of loss: suppression, assimilation, and then standardization.
Right.
So let's start with what the sources call systemic erasure. These are the deepest cuts, driven by colonization and oppression. And that has to begin with the Native American kitchen.
This is truly the colonization of the kitchen, not just the land. We are talking about the single largest loss of culinary knowledge in American history. Whole systems of cooking were just dismantled.
What's so striking is how the basic ingredients survived, but the knowledge of how to use them, that vanished. The Three Sisters is a perfect example.
It's the perfect example.
We still eat corn, beans, and squash.
Of course. But we have completely lost the intricate way of preparing them together as a primary dish.
So it's about the synergy.
It's all about the synergy. The traditional method wasn't just, throwing them in a pot. It relied on specific drying, soaping, these long cooking techniques that achieve this incredible nutritional and flavor balance.
And now?
Now, you treat corn like a vegetable. Beans are a side dish. Squash is a seasonal thing. We eat them separately, often drenched in butter or sugar, totally missing the complex preparation that made them the backbone of a whole food culture.
So the technology of cooking was lost, even if the ingredients themselves weren't.
Exactly.
And then you have foods that were just incredibly practical, powerful, and vanished because of explicit institutional bans. Pemmican really stands out here.
Pemmican is fascinating. You should think of it as the ultimate field ration.
Like an early protein bar.
The original protein bar. It was dried, pulverized meat, often bison, mixed with rendered fat and dried berries, all mashed into this dense, non-perishable block. The sources call it the true ancestor of modern energy bars or military MREs. It was a pre-industrial superfood.
But a superfood that was politically suppressed. How does something that efficient just disappear?
Because its existence depended entirely on mobility and access to traditional hunting lands.
Yeah.
So when the government forced migration, when they imposed hunting bans, when they took control of native lands,
The ingredients vanished.
the raw ingredients vanished. And on top of that, you had missionary kitchens actively promoting what they called civilized European eating habits. They pushed aside staples like pemmican and even wild rice, replacing them with industrial, mass-produced grains.
So when we see a modern exhibit on Native American cuisine, we're really just seeing fragments.
You're seeing a reconstruction. It's an effort to piece together the surviving data points after forced relocation and assimilation. The holistic, functional culinary system that sustained entire nations was purposefully dismantled.
Because that system was tied to autonomy.
And land control. Food was a political target. Simple as that.
Wow. Okay, so moving from that kind of forced suppression, let's look at the second major area of systemic erasure, the stigmatization of slave cuisine. This is what eventually gave birth to what we now call soul food.
Right. And we associate soul food with comfort today, but the original food was born of pure desperation and intense scarcity.
And that desperation meant using every single possible part of an animal or a plant.
The parts the enslavers discarded. The initial cuisine was raw, it was tough, it was intense. We're talking about meals built from hours and hours of labor-thick bone and pulp soups designed to extract every last nutrient.
Or things like fermented porridges.
Exactly. Fermented corn and legume porridges that were dense, a little sour, and just meant to fuel absolutely back-breaking work.
I can imagine those original flavors being so much more assertive, almost bracing, compared to the rich, buttery versions we often see now.
Oh, without a doubt. And this food vanished for two critical reasons, and both are related to status. first, it was deeply stigmatized as poverty food.
So once people were free, they wanted to get away from it.
Of course, as their descendants gained economic footing, they actively tried to distance themselves from the dishes that symbolized oppression. They wanted to forget the kitchen of necessity.
What's really fascinating here and what the research highlights is the role of what you mentioned earlier, racial aesthetic biases. What does that actually look like in a kitchen?
It means that when this cuisine moves from the home into a mainstream restaurant, it had to be scrubbed clean. It had to be made palatable for a broader and specifically white audience.
So dishes that looked too real.
Dishes that visually represented the harsh reality of their origins, so intense organ meats, the visceral appearance of certain awful preparations, they were polished away or sweetened significantly. The painful history that was inherent in the dishes was literally cooked out of existence.
Leaving a more marketable, softer version of the cuisine.
Exactly.
The history survived, but the painful, assertive flavors were erased for public acceptance. And that pressure to be accepted, that leads us directly into our next section. Deliberately abandoning your culinary roots for prestige, for assimilation.
This is where the story shifts. It's not about food being suppressed by an outside force anymore. It's about food being abandoned by choice, often as a way to signal cultural status. And we see this really early on with colonial American cuisine.
The early colonists, they were using resources they found here, wild game, native herbs, and created this tough, efficient food.
Very efficient. They relied heavily on single-pot meals that cooked for hours over an open fire, and their main staple was a cornmeal porridge.
But not like modern polenta.
Not at all. Much denser, much harder. That porridge was their identity, their bread. But as soon as new technologies like better ovens arrived, and as imported goods like white flour became status symbols,
They cut those roots.
they cut them completely. Their core motivation wasn't flavor, it was the desire to eat like a European. They sacrificed a unique, self-sustaining culinary tradition for imported status.
So the very first American food tradition was abandoned just for mimicry. That's a kind of culinary self-sabotage.
It absolutely is. And that desire to look American or look sophisticated continued with the next big wave of culinary loss, the first-generation immigrant foods.
Just think about the difference between classic Italian-American food, which we all know and love,
Yeah.
and what an Italian immigrant family was actually eating in, say, a New York tenement in 1910.
Oh, it's night and day. The latter was tougher, simpler, and built on maximizing every single low-cost protein.
So what exactly have we lost from that period?
If you look at the original immigrant fare, Italian, German, Eastern European, a huge part of what's gone is centered on economic necessity. We lost pasta dishes that relied heavily on offal and organ meats,
Because they were cheap.
the cheapest, most nutrient-dense protein you could get. We also lost the traditional emphasis on sour, fermented flavors, like the heavy, complex use of cabbage, which was essential for preservation before refrigeration.
And the bread. I imagine the bread was different.
Totally different. Those original breads, dense, long fermented loaves that could last a family for days. They were replaced by soft, standardized, white American sandwich bread.
So why did this practical, simple food just disappear so completely, leaving only these simplified remnants behind?
The sources are really clear on this. It was a social and generational rejection. The first generation cooked out of necessity. Their children, the second generation, were desperate to assimilate.
They wanted to shed any sign of being foreign.
Any visible or olfactory mark. So the smell of grandma's sour, long-fermented cabbage or the sight of organ meats, that became a sign of otherness that they wanted to erase.
Wow.
So simplifying the cuisine, adopting American ingredients like swapping organ meat for ground beef, replacing complex fermentation with quick industrial yeasts, that was a direct psychological tool for belonging.
That's a tragic trade-off. Assimilation for tradition.
It is. The research gives a really powerful punchline here. Pizza survived because it was simple and adaptable, but grandmother's original kitchen, the tough, authentic expression of survival, is gone.
That is a powerful point. How we use food to signal who we are. And for a generation eager to belong, shedding those old food ways was a necessary sacrifice.
A painful one.
Which brings us to our final major force of erasure, the cold logic of industrialization and standardization.
Yeah, this section shifts from cultural pressure to systemic economic pressure. And we can start with frontier foods, the cuisine of people in constant motion. Cowboys, miners, railroad builders.
Their diet had to be purely functional. It had to be non-perishable, highly caloric, and easy to cook over a fire with almost no ingredients.
Exactly. So what vanished here were these massive, single-pot, all-day boiling stews made with dried meats, and these incredibly utilitarian, high-energy mixtures that sound pretty brutal to us now.
Like what?
For example, the practical blend of coffee combined with rendered fat and flour, just mixed together into a sort of immediate, thick, energy-dense paste.
That sounds like pure fuel. Zero pleasure involved. So why did that specific tradition stop?
It stopped when the people stopped moving. As people settled into cities, the urbanization phenomenon, and adopted things like gas stoves and stationary kitchens, the need for that kind of hearty, transportable trail food it disappeared. The food stopped when the people settled down.
Okay, now let's tackle the true ancestors of fast food, early industrial worker foods. The sources suggest that while these were monotonous, they were fundamentally more real than what we have now.
They fueled the rapid industrial growth of America, and they were, filling repetitive meals, monotonous soups, hard, portable sandwiches brought from home. But the critical distinction, and the reason they were replaced, was the flavor profile.
They were about energy, not instant gratification.
They were primarily fatty and starchy, not sugary. They provided steady, slow-release energy for a grueling 12-hour shift without the crash you get from a ton of sugar. They were functional fuel.
So if this food was so efficient for the worker and for the factories, what destroyed it? What was the engine of its destruction?
The engine was the commercial explosion of sugar and corn syrup, a cheaper, mass-produced calorie source,
And advertising.
and intensive national advertising, plus powerful lobbying from the new industrial food giants. They pushed products that were shelf-stable, high-margin, and highly addictive because of the sugar. They effectively displaced all that traditional hearty fare.
The sources make this chilling, unavoidable distinction here. Real worker food died, replaced by sweet fast food. This was a profound caloric and cultural shift.
It really was. Food went from being sustenance for labor to engineered pleasure designed for maximum consumption.
And this is where the synthesis of our whole deep dive comes together, isn't it? It shows how industry and politics directly intersected to drive a class-based dietary change.
Absolutely. The traditionally prepared, simple, high-satiety meals were just replaced by cheaper, sweeter, highly advertised options that prioritize profit over the consumer's health or their long-term energy.
This has been a really compelling journey through a history that's mostly invisible,
Yeah.
highlighting that every plate of food tells a story, even if that story is about its own disappearance. So let's synthesize the 4 distinct fates we've identified.
Yeah, we can trace it all back to 4 distinct mechanisms of erasure, and they tie directly to the forces we named at the very start.
Okay.
First, indigenous foods were suppressed through political action and land dispossession.
Right.
Second, poverty foods, like the original slave cuisine, were shamed away due to class and racial aesthetic biases. Third, immigrant foods were transformed by generations seeking social assimilation.
To fit in.
And finally, laborer foods were industrialized, stripped of their nutritional integrity, and replaced by mass-market, sugary commodities, all driven by profit.
So the core conclusion here is that the American menu wasn't really lost. Its memory was erased by these calculated external pressures acting on different parts of society.
And that really leads to a necessary, and I think a challenging question for you, the listener, to consider. Given that the nourishing, non-sugary food of the industrial worker was effectively replaced by high-margin, sugary alternatives through massive commercial and lobbying efforts.
The research challenges us to ask, does this transformation suggest that modern, highly processed fast food operates less as a culinary choice and more as a highly effective, high-profit industrial strategy, shaping our national diet for reasons entirely separate from nutrition or history? Something to mull over until our next deep dive.